Hey, what's up out there, everybody? Anthony DeGioia here with the Silver Screen Analysis, bringing you the first episode in the Best of series, and to literally kick things off on the right foot, we're talking all about Jean-Claude Van Damme and covering my picks for his top 10 movies. Now, if you're familiar with me or this channel, you'll know that I grew up on a hefty diet of action movies as a kid, and I just couldn't get enough of the genre. I mean, I loved them all. Kurt Russell, Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Steven Seagal, Wesley Snipes, Bruce Willis, and so many more. They all brought something unique to the big screen that I thought really was able to make their films truly their own, but none were quite as charismatic as Jean-Claude Van Damme was. I loved Van Damme growing up, and even to this day, I still got a soft spot for the guy. If I'm sitting back and I'm looking for something to watch and I see a Van Damme movie show up, I'm more than likely to pop it on for a while, and that's something that happens quite frequently because the guy had a lot of hits. I mean, closing out the 80s and into the late 90s, Van Damme was a regular at the box office. Many of my summer vacations were filled with seeing Van Damme movies like Universal Soldier, Double Impact, and Hard Target in the theaters with my friends, and Van Damme, sure, he may not have equaled the draw of like a Schwarzenegger or a Stallone in terms of box office numbers, but he wasn't too shabby himself. Van Damme had a great run as a Hollywood action lead throughout the 90s. He also fought through years of action movies that were sent directly to video store shelves, and he started an unsuspecting comeback through a small little film festival darling movie where he took the world's attention by storm with a very gripping, raw monologue, and he would also take on Stallone as the villain in Expendables 2 and showed the world that he still had plenty of kicks left in the tank, and I gotta be honest, I couldn't have been more delighted to see it. So let's just cut the jibber jabber and let's get into my top 10 movies covering the best of Jean-Claude Van Damme. First up, I have a quirky little film written by Steven E. D'Souza from 1998 called Knockoff. Now, I know this is an odd choice when thinking of Van Damme greats, but it's actually quite entertaining in my opinion. It feels like a Hong Kong action movie with a charming, very eccentric stylizing to it. The editing techniques are creative. It gives the film a very bold, artistic vibe, and sure, the story is a bit out there, but it's still relatively unique as well. In this one, Van Damme plays a fashion designer that sells knockoffs who is going to team up with a CIA agent who's working undercover in the black market, and if that doesn't sound amazing enough for you, Rob Schneider actually plays the CIA agent, so it's without question out there, but I think it's all part of the fun. The movie is way over the top in terms of subject matter and its absurdity, but there's also a seriousness to it that makes it enjoyable. I think the action also holds up nicely with some slick camera techniques and some quality stunt work. Van Damme is slightly different in terms of his persona. He was much more somber, and I thought it worked for the character. I think it's one of his more unique films. It's vibrant and flamboyant, and I think it holds up because of just the differences that it has from all the other genre films from the time period. The international locations are appealing, the humor between Van Damme and Schneider is surprisingly effective, and it makes it a great Van Damme action comedy. Next up is a JCVD classic that many will have, I am assuming, higher on their list than mine, that being 1989's Kickboxer. This is definitely one of the movies that helped put Van Damme on the map. I've seen it just countless times growing up, and it's definitely a fun movie, but I'm not into it as much as others. It's very similar to Bloodsport, so when the choices come up for this type of movie, I always prefer that one. It, without question, has a great villain in Tong Po. Dennis Chan was serviceable comic relief in that mentor role. The international locations really add a fun depth to the story. The action, once again, was very nicely done. It really showcases the skill of the performers, and it does help make up for the lack of creative storytelling and the surface level characters. And it still is fun and nostalgic to go back and watch a young Van Damme in this very Rocky IV-esque plotline. The final fight, I think, still holds up great in terms of tension-filled action and 80s action movie melodrama. Van Damme's energy really did show that he loved every bit of being a star. Tong Po and Van Damme battling it out with their honey-soaked fists dipped in glass is just classic theatrical 80s storytelling, and some of the fighting, it's a little simplistic compared to today's standards, but there's still a broad appeal for this movie, and it's got some fantastic charismatic overacting in it as well. Next up at number 8 is another of Van Damme's more popular movies, that being Hard Target from 1993. This also was the first US produced film for director John Woo, who just created elegant 90s action with his hyper styling, and his fingerprint is all over this movie. In this one, Van Damme plays this drifter who helps a woman find her missing father, and he gets wrapped up with a group of individuals that hunt humans for sport, so it's a perfect vehicle to showcase some great Van Damme John Woo action. It's without a doubt a by-the-numbers actioner, but the styling from Woo just delivered plenty of artistic appeal to the movie. The choreography of the fight scenes was a little bit more involved, and with Woo's camera work, each scene really was visually appealing regardless of how absurd they may have been. It has plenty of gunplay, fight sequences, chase sequences, a variety of all the Van Damme moves, and surprisingly, most of the scenes hold up great all these years later, with exception of maybe standing on the motorcycle. There are admittedly a lot of cheesy moments in this movie, but they're cheesy in a good way. It's 90s action, the stunt work delivers a lot of great exciting cinema. Woo was able to take a big time name like Van Damme and elevate him to a higher level of just physical on-screen action, and with longer takes and more fluid choreography, Van Damme really was able to shine in many of the nicely edited fights. The villains are very charismatic, Van Damme has a swagger to him, and the Western Bayou vibe in the scoring adds to an already appealing action movie atmosphere. Next up on my list is what I consider to be an underrated Van Damme flick from 1996 called Maximum Risk, where Van Damme plays a cop that assumes his dead twin brother's identity to find those responsible, and the result is a very tightly crafted crime thriller. I think it's a solid action movie that kind of gets forgotten because of the weak storyline, and sure, it's a little contrived and a tad formulaic, but there are many layers of quality filmmaking to enjoy in this movie. First and foremost, the car chases are excellently captured, the confined streets of France add to the intensity, and the stunt work is impressive. The fight choreography was much grittier than most Van Damme movies, and I think the more realistic tone just elevated the tension nicely. The camera work from international director Ringo Lam in his US debut was also extremely capable. The camera movement was always fluid, the editing was minimal, and the result is a Jason Bourne level of action on the big screen for Van Damme. The story progression does feel a little bit like it's going through the motions, I won't deny that, yet it's still a solid watch. It's one of Van Damme's more sound projects. The film doesn't have the same level of charisma or flamboyance you would come to expect from JCVD, and that could be a reason why this is one of his forgotten films. His usual self-awareness was toned down a lot, but I think it worked great for capturing a darker persona to fit this story. It didn't have that studio polish despite being a big production, and I think it was primarily because of the excellent direction from Lam and the cinematography from Alexander Gruzneski. Next up on my list is one I still consider to be classic Van Damme, that being 1991's Double Impact. He played the dual roles perfectly as a pair of brothers hunting down criminals that killed their parents when they were kids, and Van Damme really managed to create two completely different personas for the characters from the ground up, and it makes the weak plotline actually work surprisingly well. From personality to tone of phrase, down to the style of fighting, it was really defined differently for both roles, and even though Van Damme was at peak self-awareness in this one, it did showcase some acting range. The action overall is nicely staged with a variety of different set pieces. The international locations are just great for adding a charming atmosphere to the story, and even though that storyline isn't very inventive, it's still just a great ride in the 90s action genre. Van Damme would also unite with Bolo Yeung from Bloodsport, and I thought Yeung delivered just a great cartoonish but still very menacing villain for Van Damme to go up against. I thought the direction in this movie was very capable as well. It resulted in some action scenes that just never felt stale due to each Van Damme taking out baddies in their own unique way. Clean-cut Van Damme is more finesse, gruff Van Damme is punching and breaking necks, and it's delightful in both ways. It works in also one of the most useless sex scenes in the genre, but it culminates with Van Damme fighting itself, so it's a nicely crafted subplot. It's bloody, it has plenty of explosions, fight scenes, and shootouts, and it knows exactly how seriously to take itself, making it one of Van Damme's best. Now that leads us to the middle of the pack, and at number 5 is going to be Bloodsport from 1988, a movie that very much helped launch Van Damme into an international star. As the 80s progressed, action leads like Chuck Norris and Charles Bronson and Clint Eastwood were aging. The decade was kind of the beginning of a shift into that new wave of action heroes, with like Stallone and Schwarzenegger beginning that movement, and Bloodsport would be one that would springboard Van Damme into that category, much like Die Hard did for Bruce Willis the same year. Now, Bloodsport was admittedly not the best acted. It's also loaded with montages and some editing techniques that will remind you of an employee training video, but it's also classic 80s cinema with a cheesy musical score that is nothing short of awesome. It has a ton of nicely choreographed fight sequences, many eccentric fighters, and a great villain in Bolo Yeung. It's one of those movies that always lures me in with just the different fighters and the story of Van Damme's revenge. And you can't fault the movie like many other action movies from the genre. The montages all kind of work, the cheesy 80s music is perfect, and it's just a great vehicle to showcase the physical attributes of Van Damme to the world. He had the looks, he had the on-screen skill to be an action lead. This movie would just bring him into a star, and his box office run would really start after this one and last nearly a decade, and it's just always fun to go back and watch this movie and watch him just spin kick his way through a bunch of video game-like fighters. Next up on my list is what I consider to be an overlooked movie from 1995, that being Sudden Death. Now, some Die Hard ripoffs are much more blatant than others, and this one followed the formula to a T, but it was still just a very tense, capable action thriller. Powers Booth was a great villain, and Van Damme brought a lot of heart and physical action to a character that was more than your usual one-dimensional action lead. Van Damme's all over the stadium, the action scenes were tightly edited and very adrenaline pumping, the fight choreography was nice and sound, the practical stunt work I think still holds up great today, and I think this is one of Van Damme's better overall movies in terms of those that hold up over the years. All the chaos going on during the hockey game I thought was just a fun playground for the action. It built in an uneasiness to the film that really put Van Damme up against the clock. It's certainly formulaic, but it does show effort, which makes it a great time watching Van Damme try to save a stadium full of people and his son. The storyline moving along with the progression of the hockey game gives the movie a fast pace. It really keeps you on edge despite the simplicity. It's a fun action movie that knew exactly what it wanted to accomplish, and I think it succeeded. Powers Booth was just very menacing, and despite his material being a little bit on the routine side, he was able to make his character his own. This movie just delivers entertaining action throughout the stadium, and it all leads to a great showdown over the ice with Van Damme saving the day and becoming a hero to his son, and what's not to love about that? And just like that, we're spin kicking our way into the top 3, and at number 3 is just a trademark Van Damme movie, of course being Universal Soldier from 1992, where he co-starred alongside Dolph Lundgren. This movie is still awesome to this day, and Lundgren was a fantastic villain. The plot to me was interesting. It had many fresh elements to it at the time, first and foremost being the intrigue of two big action stars going head to head, and Lundgren wasn't as big of a name as Van Damme, but he was pretty close. His name was out there amongst the fans, so it did create that inevitable face-off that made this movie so appealing. It does have some flaws to it, but they are minor. It's just a classic 90s action movie filled with big personalities, big characters, and loads of violent action. Dolph Lundgren played crazy very well as the unhinged soldier with a necklace of ears. He delivered that sizable opponent to Van Damme that was just able to create that bit of doubt in Van Damme's success, and it really kept the tension locked in. The action in this movie delivers plenty of explosions, gunplay, tension-filled pursuits, and a lot of violent fight sequences filled with all the bravado you could want from the genre. Van Damme also has a couple of fun fish-out-of-water moments, and he plays robotic very well, and Lundgren's story arc is the best thing in the movie. He was awesome as he loses control and takes over the Unisols. You can feel the tension is building as he tracks Van Damme down, and even to this day, it's great 90s cinema. The practical effects hold up nicely, so does the stunt work. The digital effects are more nostalgic than dated, and seeing Van Damme and Lundgren battle in the rain is just as amazingly theatrical now as it was back then.
You're dead, soldier. No, I'm alive.
Coming up next at number 2, I have Timecop from 1994. I think this movie still holds up great today because of the surprisingly layered storyline. It isn't perfect, but I think it's more than intricate enough for a 90s action sci-fi movie. There aren't a lot of glaring plot holes, and the performances are pretty solid. Van Damme is great in the lead. As a man tormented by the grief from his past, it's really easy to invest in this character. There's just an interesting element of mystery to the story, and it makes it just fun watching Van Damme's Agent Walker search for clues to the truth. Yet it still has a lot of Van Damme charisma. The movie takes itself seriously, therefore the viewer can as well. It has a nice collection of very creative action set pieces. The special effects were very cutting edge for the time. They still look more than serviceable today. Ron Silver, I'll admit, he wasn't the best villain, but with plenty of other henchmen in his crowd, there never was a shortage of violent, gritty fights that I thought were very nicely crafted. Hyam's direction was very fluid, and the editing in this movie is just better than a lot of movies in the genre today. There's also a nice use of practical effects and some great production design that blends in with the digital work to give the film a strong visual appeal. This one offers much more than I think your typical action sci-fi movie, and the films are still a great watch today. It works through multiple timelines easily, and it never feels messy like a lot of time travel movies can. And what I like about this movie is that despite having a ton of creative action sequences littered throughout, is a storyline that on its own is still very engaging. And we have reached the top of my list. Coming in at number 1, my personal favorite Van Damme movie, surprisingly enough, Nowhere to Run from 1993 alongside Rosanna Arquette and Ted Levine. I thought this was a solid action movie that delivered plenty of violence, but through a much more grounded approach. Van Damme was all the action lead you could ask for, but his energy was dialed back enough to really allow the heart of the plotline to resonate. He delivered a great persona of this fugitive that gets caught in the middle of a land deal between a massive corporation and a widow and her young kids, and caring about this plotline and the characters is what really gives the action more weight. It's got all you could ask for in the villain. It has plenty of nicely shot action that really does get the adrenaline going, but there's also an emotional connection to the plot that really can lure you in. The chemistry between Van Damme and Arquette was effective because it was dialed back a bit. Arquette really brought the film a strong female lead character for 90s action fare, and I thought the connection between Van Damme and young Kieran Culkin was fantastic. It's a little on the cliche side, but their friendship felt much more sincere. It really made you want to see Van Damme take down this group of dirty land developers to help this family out. I also thought moving the setting of the story out to the countryside allowed for the just the styling of the action to change up as well for what we have been used to seeing from Van Damme movies. He's got a fun scene on a motorcycle, a lot of cool fight scenes that really increase the suspense and keep the pace going when needed, and with Ted Levine embracing the role of villain with just a natural comfort, the tension builds up nicely for their final showdown. You know Van Damme will likely succeed, but you can't be too sure how the small family is going to turn out when the story ends, and that's what makes this movie offer a little bit more layers of quality than your average 90s action movie storytelling. And that's why I love this movie and why I consider it to be my favorite in the library of the muscles from Brussels. And I hope you guys enjoyed my list. Please let me know what some of your favorite movies are from Jean-Claude Van Damme down in the comments. There's no doubt going to be many action movie leads in the history of the genre, but I don't think any are going to have that package of charisma that JCVD brought to his movies, that he continues to bring to his movies to this day and will continue bringing to hopefully many more years of movies. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, drop it a thumbs up, leave a comment below. I'd love to talk movies with you guys. Share it with your friends, and without question, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you can never miss a video. Here are some links to some recent reviews just in case you missed them. All my social media links and the link to our official website are down in the description below, and I'll catch you next time.